The Pastor Joel Osteen mystery is finally solved, and it isn't good. Every Sunday, millions of Americans tune in to watch Pastor Joel Osteen deliver his trademark message of positivity and prosperity, his perfect smile beaming from television screens across the nation, with his best-selling books, packed arena appearances, and a church that was once the Houston Rockets basketball arena. Osteen has become the friendly face of modern Christianity for many Americans, a preacher who promises that faith will lead to abundance in all areas of life. But behind that million-dollar smile and carefully crafted image lies a web of contradictions and troubling questions that have haunted Osteen's ministry for years, from his $10.5 million mansion in Houston's most exclusive neighborhood to the mysterious discovery of cash and checks hidden in the church walls. The gap between Osteen's public persona and the reality of his operation has become impossible to ignore. What you see on television is a carefully constructed product, revealed a former Lakewood church staff member who worked closely with the Osteen family for over 5 years. The Joel who talks about humility and sacrifice on Sunday morning lives a life of luxury and privilege that would shock most of his followers if they saw it up close. Indeed, while Osteen preaches about God's blessings and abundance, the extent of his personal wealth and the methods by which his ministry operates have raised serious concerns among religious scholars, former insiders, and even devoted Christians who question whether his interpretation of the gospel aligns with the teachings of Jesus. There's always been a disconnect between the pastors who live in mansions and the carpenter from Nazareth who had nowhere to lay his head, noted Dr. Michael Wilson, a professor of religious studies who has studied America's megachurch movement for decades. But the Osteen case represents something more troubling, a systematic effort to repackage Christianity as a pathway to material wealth, while avoiding the challenging moral demands at the heart of the faith. Most shocking of all may be the revelations from former Lakewood church employees who describe an operation that functions more like a corporation than a ministry, where decisions about sermons, outreach, and even charity work are driven by market research, brand management, and revenue potential rather than spiritual discernment. When Hurricane Harvey devastated Houston in 2017, leaving thousands homeless and desperate for shelter, the true nature of Osteen's ministry was laid bare for the world to see, and what became visible in that moment of crisis continues to haunt his public image, despite the relentless efforts to maintain his carefully crafted persona. Today, we're finally solving the mystery behind one of America's most successful and controversial religious figures, pulling back the curtain on Joel Osteen's empire to reveal the startling contradictions between the message and the messenger that raise profound questions about faith, wealth, and authenticity in modern American religion.
God is in control, that nothing can happen to you without His permission. They made this decision.
Mansion of Faith, the lavish lifestyle that doesn't match the message. Joel Osteen's public image is carefully constructed around his warm smile, humble demeanor, and messages of gratitude and God's goodness. He frequently tells his congregation and television audience about the importance of being thankful for life's simple blessings, finding contentment, and maintaining humility before God. What this humble persona doesn't reveal is the extraordinary wealth and luxury that characterize Osteen's actual lifestyle, a reality that stands in stark contrast to both his modest public presentation and the traditional Christian values of simplicity and sacrifice. The gap between the Joel Osteen you see on television and the way he actually lives is staggering, explained a former security contractor who worked at the Osteen residence for several events. While he preaches about being grateful for the small things, he lives in a mansion that would make most celebrities envious. That mansion, a 17,000 square foot estate in River Oaks, Houston's most exclusive neighborhood, is valued at approximately $10.5 million. The property features 6 bedrooms, 6 bathrooms, 3 elevators, a pool house, and a guest house, all situated behind imposing iron gates that ensure privacy and security. Former visitors describe marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and custom woodwork throughout the residence. He preaches humility from a house bigger than most hotels, noted religious scholar Dr. Robert Jenkins, who has written extensively on the prosperity gospel movement. There's a fundamental disconnect between telling people to be content with what they have while living in a level of luxury unimaginable to most of your followers. The Osteen home is just one aspect of a lifestyle that includes private jet travel, luxury vehicles, and designer clothing that would seem at odds with the teachings of Jesus about wealth and material possessions. Former staff members report that Osteen's wardrobe consists largely of custom-tailored suits worth thousands of dollars each, and he has been photographed wearing watches valued at over $15,000. What makes this lavish lifestyle particularly noteworthy is how it's financed. Since 2004, Osteen has publicly stated that he does not take a salary from Lakewood Church, a fact his defenders often cite when questions about his wealth arise. Instead, his income derives primarily from his many best-selling books, which have reportedly earned him tens of millions of dollars. The "I don't take a church salary" line is one of the most brilliant PR moves in religious history, observed a former publishing executive who worked with several prosperity gospel authors. It creates the impression of sacrifice while obscuring the reality that the church platform is what makes the book sell in the first place. It's like a celebrity saying they don't take a salary for appearing on a magazine cover. They don't need to because the publicity drives their real income. Lakewood Church itself operates as a tax-exempt religious organization, meaning it pays no property taxes on its massive facility, the former Compaq Center, once home to the Houston Rockets, and is not required to disclose its finances publicly. Religious finance experts estimate the church brings in between $70 to $90 million annually in tax-free donations. Yet unlike many traditional churches, it does not publish detailed financial statements for its members. This lack of financial transparency extends to Osteen's personal wealth as well. While estimates place his net worth between $50 to $100 million, the actual figure is difficult to determine due to the complex structure of his business enterprises and the privacy afforded to religious organizations under U.S. tax law. When you look at the early Christian church, there was radical financial transparency, noted theologian Dr. Sarah Mitchell. The book of Acts describes believers sharing their resources openly and ensuring no one had needs while others lived in luxury. Osteen's operation represents the opposite approach, a deliberate opacity about money that prevents followers from understanding the full picture. Former Lakewood staff members describe an organizational culture where money is simultaneously emphasized and obscured, where congregants are continually encouraged to give generously as a demonstration of faith, while the details of how those donations are used remain largely hidden from view. There was always this disconnect between the constant appeals for donations and the obvious wealth of the leadership, said a former Lakewood administrative employee who requested anonymity. We were told to emphasize that giving was about planting seeds for God's blessing, but many staff members privately wondered why an organization with such enormous resources needed to constantly ask for more. The lifestyle disparity becomes even more striking when contrasted with the financial reality of many Lakewood attendees. According to demographic data, a significant portion of Osteen's followers come from lower to middle-income backgrounds, with many giving sacrificially to support the ministry despite their own financial challenges. You have people living paycheck to paycheck giving money they can barely afford because they believe it will lead to God's financial blessing, observed Jenkins. Meanwhile, the person encouraging them to give lives in a mansion and flies private. There's a fundamental ethical question there that goes beyond theology to basic fairness and transparency. Osteen's defenders argue that his wealth comes primarily from his books and that he deserves the fruits of his success. They point out that he built Lakewood into the largest church in America and reaches millions with his message of hope. From this perspective, his prosperity simply demonstrates the principles he preaches, that God blesses those who are faithful and positive. Critics counter that this defense misses the deeper contradictions between Osteen's lifestyle and the explicit teachings of Jesus about wealth, who warned about the spiritual dangers of riches and called his followers to sacrificial generosity. They also question whether the source of Osteen's wealth actually matters when the enormous disparity between leader and followers creates a system where those with the least give to support the lifestyle of someone who already has the most. The early church would have been scandalized by this arrangement, said Mitchell. Jesus didn't say, "Blessed are the rich in private jets and mansions." He said the exact opposite, that it's extraordinarily difficult for the wealthy to enter God's kingdom. That's the message you'll never hear in a Joel Osteen sermon.
That sickness should take you out, but healing is coming. That bad break should keep you in debt.
Closed doors. The Hurricane Harvey scandal that exposed everything. In late August 2017, Hurricane Harvey slammed into the Texas coast, bringing unprecedented rainfall and catastrophic flooding to Houston. As the city found itself underwater, with thousands of residents displaced from their homes and desperately seeking shelter, attention turned to the massive Lakewood Church building, a 16,800-seat former sports arena that seemed an ideal location to house flood victims. What happened next became one of the most revealing moments in Joel Osteen's public career, exposing aspects of his ministry that years of carefully managed public relations had successfully concealed. As waters rose throughout Houston and emergency shelters quickly reached capacity, social media users began questioning why Lakewood Church, one of the city's largest buildings, remained closed to those seeking refuge. Photos circulated showing the church's exterior apparently accessible and largely undamaged, contradicting the official statement from Lakewood that claimed the facility was inaccessible due to severe flooding. Houston was drowning. His doors were locked, recalled Maria Gonzalez, a Houston resident who lost her home in the flooding and sought shelter at various locations throughout the crisis. We weren't asking for money or special treatment, just for them to open a building that sits empty most of the week to keep people safe and dry. The public outcry grew rapidly as news outlets picked up the story, contrasting Lakewood's closed doors with numerous smaller churches and mosques throughout Houston that had immediately opened as emergency shelters despite having far fewer resources than Osteen's mega ministry. Former Houston Chronicle reporter Robert Downen, who covered the controversy, described the rapidly unfolding public relations disaster. What made the situation particularly damaging was the contrast between Osteen's constant messages about generosity and Christian love versus the apparent reluctance to inconvenience his organization to help desperate people. It struck many Houstonians as the height of hypocrisy. As criticism mounted, Lakewood Church issued a series of evolving statements. First, they claimed the building was inaccessible. When photos contradicted this narrative, they stated the basement levels had flooded, making the facility unsafe, though this didn't explain why upper levels couldn't be utilized. Finally, they announced the church would open as a distribution center for supplies and eventually as a shelter, but only after days of devastating public criticism. The changing explanations did significant damage to Osteen's credibility, noted crisis management expert Rebecca Simon. If the church had simply opened its doors immediately, even if there were legitimate logistical challenges, the public would have been forgiving. Instead, the hesitation followed by changing justifications created the impression they were responding to bad publicity rather than genuine concern. What many found particularly troubling was Osteen's initial response to the crisis. While Houston was underwater, his social media accounts continued posting generic inspirational messages without acknowledging the disaster or offering specific help. When he finally addressed the situation directly, it came after days of public criticism and appeared reactive rather than proactive. Former Lakewood staff members later revealed that the delayed response reflected deeper institutional priorities that were normally hidden from public view. There was immediate concern about potential damage to the building and equipment, confided a former Lakewood facilities manager. Millions had been invested in audio-visual systems, carpeting, and infrastructure. The discussions I heard were primarily about protecting those assets rather than how many people we could help. It was a revealing moment that showed where the true priorities lay. Other former staff members described a leadership culture focused on image management rather than emergency response. The first meetings weren't about mobilizing to help, they were about messaging and how to handle the PR situation, said a former communications team member who requested anonymity. There was more concern about how Lakewood would be perceived than about the immediate needs of flood victims. What made the Harvey incident particularly significant was how it contradicted the carefully constructed narrative Osteen had built over decades. His message consistently emphasized God's blessings, positive thinking, and abundance, a theology that seemed ill-equipped to address real human suffering and sacrifice when an actual crisis emerged. Prosperity theology looks appealing when everything is going well, observed religious scholar Dr. Michael Wilson, but it lacks the spiritual resources to address suffering, sacrifice, and genuine tragedy. When Harvey hit, Osteen's theology had no framework for placing institutional comfort below human need, because that kind of sacrifice isn't part of the prosperity gospel narrative. The contrast with other religious organizations during the same crisis was striking. Numerous smaller churches, mosques, and synagogues throughout Houston opened immediately as shelters. Despite having far fewer resources than Lakewood Mattress Mac, a local furniture store owner, gained national attention for immediately opening his showrooms to flood victims, creating an unflattering comparison with Osteen's delayed response. What the Harvey incident revealed wasn't just a PR mistake, but a fundamental contradiction at the heart of Osteen's ministry, noted Wilson. His message is about God's abundant blessings and living your best life, but Christianity at its core is about sacrifice, service, and putting others before yourself, precisely what seemed absent in those crucial early days of the flood. Though Lakewood eventually opened its doors and participated in relief efforts, the damage to Osteen's image was substantial and enduring. The incident created a lasting impression that when faced with a choice between institutional comfort and meeting urgent human needs, Lakewood's priority was self-protection rather than self-sacrifice. Houston was drowning. His doors were locked, became more than just a criticism of a single decision. It emerged as a metaphor for the perceived gap between Osteen's uplifting messages and the actual priorities of his organization when tested by real-world crisis.
Fault them if they don't, but this is just the way I choose to live my life and what I teach based out of the Scripture. So I don't think,
Preaching prosperity, avoiding adversity, he avoids talking about sin, hell, or hard truths. One of the most distinctive aspects of Joel Osteen's ministry, and perhaps the key to his massive popularity, is what he doesn't say. While traditional Christian preaching typically includes significant emphasis on human sinfulness, the reality of divine judgment, and the call to moral transformation, Osteen has built his brand on a deliberately selective version of Christianity that emphasizes positive thinking while avoiding these more challenging aspects of the faith. He smiles through every sermon and skips anything uncomfortable, observed theologian Dr. Richard Martinez, who has studied the content of Osteen's messages over a 15-year period. If you compare the topics covered in his sermons with the actual content of the Bible, you find entire categories of teaching, particularly those dealing with human brokenness, divine judgment, and the cost of discipleship, are simply absent. This selective approach to Christian teaching is immediately apparent to anyone familiar with traditional theology. Osteen rarely mentions sin, avoids the concept of hell entirely, and seldom references Jesus' numerous teachings about the dangers of wealth or the call to sacrificial service. Instead, his messages focus almost exclusively on themes of personal empowerment, positive thinking, and material blessing. It's Christianity with all the uncomfortable bits removed, noted Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a professor of comparative religion. Jesus talked more about money than almost any other topic, but his message was primarily about its spiritual dangers, and the call to generous giving. Osteen completely inverts this, presenting wealth as the evidence of God's favor rather than a spiritual risk. Former Lakewood church insiders describe this selective theology as a deliberate marketing strategy rather than simply a personal emphasis or interpretation. There were explicit conversations about what topics would or wouldn't connect with the audience we were trying to reach, revealed a former content developer who worked on Osteen's messages. Anything that might make people uncomfortable or challenge their lifestyle was systematically removed. The goal wasn't theological faithfulness, it was audience growth and retention. This approach extends beyond Osteen's preaching to Lakewood's broader ministry philosophy. Unlike many churches that maintain specific doctrinal positions on controversial social or moral issues, Osteen has consistently avoided taking clear stands on topics ranging from abortion to same-sex marriage to racial justice, despite being repeatedly asked to clarify his views in media interviews. The deliberate ambiguity is strategic, explained a former Lakewood executive pastor. Once you take a clear position on any divisive issue, you potentially alienate a segment of your audience. By remaining vague and focusing exclusively on personal positivity, you maintain the broadest possible appeal. It's a business decision masked as theological humility. This avoidance of controversy extends to Osteen's approach to political issues as well. While many prominent pastors on both the religious right and left engage with policy matters they consider morally significant, Osteen has carefully maintained a studied neutrality that critics argue represents an abdication of moral leadership. The problem isn't that he avoids partisanship. Many thoughtful religious leaders do that, noted ethicist Dr. James Peterson. The issue is that he avoids moral clarity on issues where the Christian tradition has historically felt compelled to speak. When you claim to represent Christianity but remain silent on issues of justice, oppression, and human dignity, that silence itself becomes a moral position. What makes this selective approach particularly noteworthy is how dramatically it departs from the historical Christian tradition while still claiming its authority and identity. Traditional Christian preaching across denominations has typically included a balance of what theologians call law and gospel, both the challenging demands of God's moral expectations and the gracious gift of forgiveness and reconciliation. Osteen offers the comfort without the challenge, the blessing without the demand, observed Martinez. It's like prescribing the dessert course of Christianity without the main meal, pleasing to the palate but ultimately lacking the nutritional substance the faith was designed to provide. Former Lakewood attenders describe the psychological appeal of this approach, particularly for those struggling with life challenges or carrying guilt from past mistakes. "When I first started attending, it felt like such a relief," said former member Rebecca Johnson. "My previous church experience had been heavy on guilt and judgment. Joel made me feel good about myself and my future. It was only years later that I realized something essential was missing: any real call to moral transformation or service beyond self-improvement. This emphasis on positive thinking and personal blessing, rather than moral transformation or social responsibility, has drawn sharp criticism from theologians across the denominational spectrum. Both conservative evangelical leaders and progressive mainline scholars have questioned whether Osteen's teaching represents authentic Christianity or a form of motivational speaking dressed in religious language. When Jesus said, "Take up your cross and follow me," he wasn't describing a pathway to your best life now, noted evangelical theologian Dr. Mark Simmons. The cross represents suffering and sacrifice, precisely the elements Osteen systematically removes from his presentation of the faith. The result is something that might make people feel better temporarily, but fails to address the deeper human need for moral purpose and transcendent meaning. Perhaps most telling is Osteen's approach to human suffering and injustice. While traditional Christian theology has devoted considerable attention to making sense of pain and developing resources for confronting evil, Osteen's messages typically treat suffering as either a temporary setback on the path to blessing or the result of negative thinking patterns that can be overcome through changed attitudes. There's almost no theological framework in Osteen's teaching for addressing genuine tragedy or systemic injustice, observed Mitchell. When faced with cancer, poverty, or oppression, the prosperity gospel has little to offer beyond "stay positive and expect your miracle," a message that can become cruel when the miracle doesn't materialize. This theological selectivity creates a religious product perfectly calibrated for the modern consumer mentality. Christianity is a self-improvement program rather than a call to moral transformation and service to others. By systematically removing the challenging demands while retaining the comforting promises, Osteen has created a message with enormous appeal in a culture already oriented toward comfort and convenience. He's mastered the art of making people feel spiritual without actually challenging them to change, concluded Martinez. That's an incredibly marketable skill in contemporary America, and a fundamental betrayal of the tradition he claims to represent.
Think of it like this. For every peace stealer you allow in your life, you are 20% more likely to live stressed, on edge, to have a crisis.
Corporate faith, former staff say it's a media empire, not a ministry. Behind the scenes at Lakewood Church, far from the television cameras and the adoring crowds, exists an organizational culture that former employees describe as more corporate than ministerial, a sophisticated media operation focused on brand management, audience metrics, and revenue generation rather than spiritual formation or authentic community. "You weren't working for a pastor. You were working for a brand," explained a former senior staff member who spent 5 years in Lakewood's media department. "Everything, and I mean everything, was analyzed through the lens of how it would affect the Joel Osteen brand, not through traditional ministry considerations like theological faithfulness or spiritual impact." This corporate approach manifests in numerous aspects of Lakewood's operations, from the highly produced worship services to the carefully controlled public messaging to the sophisticated market research that informs virtually every decision. We conducted focus groups and audience testing that would impress a Madison Avenue advertising firm, revealed a former marketing consultant who worked with Lakewood for 3 years. Sermon topics, book titles, stage design, even Joel's clothing choices. All were tested with sample audiences to maximize appeal and minimize anything that might create negative reactions. According to former staff members, This market-driven approach extends to the content of Osteen's messages themselves, which are crafted through a process more akin to product development than traditional sermon preparation. There was a team of people who would identify themes that resonated with audience metrics, explained a former content developer. They would pull together uplifting anecdotes, craft memorable phrases, and structure messages to create emotional high points at specific intervals. Joel would then review and personalize the content, but the core product was developed like any other media offering, designed to maximize audience retention and drive specific consumer actions like book purchases or donations. This description stands in stark contrast to how sermon development is approached in most Christian traditions, where theological studies